Um, some of you know that my this year, which has been busy and difficult for a number of reasons for me, and for all of us, um, I have been on a in a process of studying the whole Jewish Bible, the whole Tanakh from start to finish. Um, and I, at the beginning of this process, bought myself a new copy of the Tanakh, and it's been an interesting sort of visual representation of where I am in the process of this year because I'm almost done. Um, and as it happens, um, this the I've been studying at a clip of about 20 chapters a week. And I've been studying when you're studying at a clip of 20 chapters a week, you don't really have the luxury to look at commentary very much. And one of the things that I have been doing, which is different from the way that I've studied Bible before, is just relying on my own sensibilities of what I'm reading into and taking out of the text. And so that's been particularly interesting. And as it happens, this week I'm concluding my study of the book of Job. The book of Job is long. It's 42 chapters. And the book of Job is intense in a lot of ways. And many of us think we know the story of Job. And what we actually know about Job is what's written in the first two chapters. And maybe the last chapter, because those are the narrative sections of the story, right? The book of Job, the first chapter, we have this sort of odd scene where God is in an assembly with who are called the B'nai Elohim, right? The children of God, which is kind of a weird phrase that sort of speaks to our itchy sensibilities around maybe Christianity and, ideas like what is a child of God. And the last time we heard that phrase in the Bible was all the way back in the book of Genesis. So one question that scholars ask is, when is Job situated in the Bible, right? We're in the book of writings. The book of writings is, the consensus is that the book of writings is not chronological, and in fact that parts of the book of writings should be actually interpolated into other parts of the text. And that's why if you look at the Christian ordering of the New Testament, things like the book of Ruth, come before the books of Kings, because Ruth is an ancestor of David. So, of course Ruth should come before Kings and not, shoved into a collection of writings at the end. So scholars have no idea where to place Job, but some believe that Job and Abraham may have lived at the same time. And there seems to be a theory that's obviously unprovable, but since people hypothesize that Job is the prophet or the monotheist that God doesn't choose when God chooses Abraham to perpetuate God's nation. And because there's language that kind of parallels Abraham's situation. And so my point is, it's amorphous. And I think it's amorphous on purpose, right? Job is the everyman. Job is the worst possibility of what's going on. And Job is kind of the antithesis of what the bulk of the Bible wants us to believe about God. I'm gonna take that back in about 20 minutes, but I'm gonna say it anyway. For the most part, Job is the antithesis of what the Bible wants us to believe about God, which is God is good to good people and bad to bad people, right? The beginnings of the Bible seems to want us to believe that, right? Speaking from a personal place for anybody who's been following the posts that I've been making on this study, which is in memory of my son, that there's a moment in the book of Exodus where the Torah tells us, if you are good people, mothers won't be bereaved of children. Well, so, if I believed that, then I would be in a bad place right now. And so, but I think that Job comes to answer that, which is to say, God sometimes orchestrates bad things to happen to people who don't deserve it. Now, the one other thing I want to say before we jump into the meat of this is that there's a dialogue in chapter 1 of Job between God and the Satan. It's the first time the Satan appears in the Bible. And I want to be very clear that and make a distinction that the Jewish Bible does not have a conception of Satan, like you would hear in English, as a parallel to Lucifer or to the devil, right? When we say the Satan, and if you're looking at Job, I'm going to put this up on the screen. I'm on Job chapter 1, just to show you this. Here we go. Close the commentary. Chapter 1 of Job. Lord says, here it says, the adversary. I would say that the Satan, and I would challenge us to pronounce it Satan when we're talking about the Hebrew conception of this being that maybe in later Christian scripture gets to be defined as Satan or the devil. I think the Jewish conception of the Satan is actually that Satan is closer to the devil's advocate, idiomatically. So God says to Satan, where have you been? Verse 7. And the Satan says, I've been roaming all over the earth. Now, this is actually a reflection, mishut ba'aretz u'mithalech ba. This is an echo of something we heard in the very first few chapters of Genesis, where God is taking a stroll around the Garden of Eden. And the Lord says to the Satan, have you taken notice of my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth. He is blameless and upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. And instantly the Satan says, he doesn't say whether he's taken note of Job. He just says, well, Job has a good reason to fear God, because you have fenced him round, him and his household and all that he has. You have spoiled him, God. You have blessed his efforts so that his possessions spread out. But lay your hand upon all that he has, and he will surely blaspheme you. Right? Laying down the gauntlet. And Job, and so Satan in this moment says to God, God says back to Satan with no context, right? We don't have any context for like whether God is challenged, whether God is angry, whether God is cocky or confident or whatever. We just hear the Lord reply to the Satan, everything Job has is in your power, but do not lay a hand on him. Don't hurt his person, but you can be in control of making his life bad and or rather doing things to the things that he owns. And so the context then is that the Satan orchestrates that Job has 10 children. They all die. All of everything he has, God's fire falls from heaven. Take hold of your sheep, and the boys burn them up. And there are 4 messengers. I'm cruising right along because I want to get to the context. I'm just giving some context. And his 10 children are all now dead. Everything he has is lost. And it is in the second chapter that the Satan goes back to God and says, I just messed with Job's life, but you told me that I wasn't allowed to mess with him, and he still fears you, or he still hasn't blasphemed you. And God says, okay, you can afflict Job with a plague. So the first time, we don't actually know, right? We know that these messengers tell Job what's going to happen to his family. We don't know that Job sees what's happened. The narrative kind of ramps up very quickly. But the first expression of grief that Job has is in verse 20 of chapter 1. Vayakom Iyov vayikra et me'ilo. The first thing he does is he tears his clothes. So one of the things that I want us to track as we're looking at these sources is what are the expressions of grief that Job is aware of, or that Job performs, that we also do, right? That it has been some amount of time since Job to 2020, or 5780 as it were. But there are similarities to the way that we practice expressions of grief in Judaism, and for me, that's powerful, right? To think that there's a continuity there. So what he says here is, Arom yatzati mi beten imi va'arom ashuv shama. Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. It's a statement of his own mortality. Which, by the way, the idea of him returning to his mother's womb is kind of an interesting, he doesn't say, I am dust and to dust I will return. And maybe that's something that we can consider. But the very next thing that he says is, Adonai Natan v'Adonai Lakach, Yehi Shem Adonai Mevorach. And this is something, if we've been through a death in our family, if we've been the mourner, we've heard these words, because these are the words that we say just after we tear a ribbon or a garment, and we bless God, Dayan Ha'emet. So God gives and God takes away. May blessed be the name of the Lord. And I will confess, some of this is personal for me, and I will say in advance that I appreciate that some of this, this hour that we have together, is my own expression of what's going on with me. And I will say that one of my first thoughts upon reading this story was, how dare I compare, right? Job, I lost one child and Job lost 10. And so of course my grief should be less, or that my experience should be less. And instantly I found myself challenging myself to say, it's not helpful to compare one person's experience to another, right? It's true that Job is not only the everyman, but Job is somebody to whom something really bad happened, and yet, and maybe that's the point, right? If it's a narrative, we can have a conversation at some other point about whether biblical stories are true to the letter of the word, but immediately at the beginning of this book, I found myself saying to myself, I need to take a step back and say, I'm still entitled to my feelings, as anybody who's going through something is entitled to having feelings, and not to compare their experience to somebody else's, even Job's. But we hear, right, Bechol zot lo chata Iyov, velo natan tefila leElohim. For all that, Job did not sin. And the way that they translate this is, Job did not cast reproach toward God. But if you look at the Hebrew, what it says is velo natan tefila leElohim, which probably means something more like Job didn't give up praying to God. So what happens then, right? Job is, it's at that moment that the Satan goes back to God and is like, I can't break Job. And so God gives him the opportunity, gives the Satan the opportunity to give Job what's called shechin, which you should recognize from one of the 10 plagues, right? It's the plague of boils. And there's this moment which is exceptional in chapter 2 of Job. So let's remember that in many stories of the Bible, there's a song from a show called In the Beginning, which basically says, this man begot this man, begot this man, begot this man, but, did they have wives? And Job's wife speaks here. So let's remember that if Job lost 10 children, 3 daughters, 7 sons, that so did his wife. And so Job has boils, which are apparently itchy. So we're told in chapter 2, Job takes a potsherd to scratch himself and sits in ashes. Vatomer lo ishto odecha machazik betumatecha barech Elohim vamut. His wife says to him, "Why do you still keep your integrity?" It's an accusation. Why do you still keep your integrity intact? Blaspheme God. Now, so again, the Hebrew is unclear here because what it says is Barech Elohim, which means bless God. Robert Alter says that he thinks that that's a euphemism, right? That they didn't want to write curse God, and so it says bless God, but what it means is curse God from the context, and die, right? So her impression here, and this is the only line she's got in the whole book, even though, spoiler alert, Job goes on to have 10 more children, and we don't learn that he gets another wife, so presumably that's all her. And he comes back to her and he says, you talk as any shameless woman might talk. Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful. This lesson, I think, is a powerful one. Number one, Gam et hatov nekabel me'et ha'elohim ve'et hara lo nekabel. Can you, this is a strong theological statement. Job is ultimately a book about theology. Could we possibly, is it kosher for us to take the good but not take the bad? Right? One of my favorite theologies, or from study, not necessarily one that I hold, is Primo Levi in his book Survivor in Auschwitz, which was published in every other country under the title If This Is a Man. And he never says it explicitly, but basically over the course of the book, when he expresses theology, he says, God, you don't exist. This resonates deeply with me. God, you don't exist is the ultimate paradox, right? I am not going to affirm that God exists, but I am not going to stop speaking to God anyway. I think here, this message, right, we have to take the good with the evil, right, is, as I would say, theology. The theological rubber hits the road at the moment that bad things happen, right? Our theology, our belief in God gets tested when we have bad things happen to us, and we either affirm or change our beliefs because of those traumatic events. But also, the other lesson I want to learn from this is not all couples grieve the same over the same losses. And it's certainly true that many losses cause there's some statistic that I was reading a while ago which said something like couples bereaved of children have a 50% divorce rate or something. And that's because in many cases couples don't grieve the same way and don't respect each other for the different ways in which they handle that grief. And so, if somebody handles grief differently, right? If I want to put pictures of my son all around my house and my husband does not want me to do that, those are those are moments where you get into sort of absolute discussions, and arguments, and we are all we can all fall victim to that, not just in moments of bereavement, but the differences of opinion which bring us, of course, to have differences of opinion with our spouses that are more and less heated. And I'm distressed because for me, I want to hear more about the wife of Job. And as far as I can tell, nobody's ever written about her. So maybe that'll be something I keep thinking about. So what happens is Job, right? This was chapter 2, verse 10 finishing. So this is what happens exactly next, but I divided it because this is kind of the next episode. So Job is bereaved of 10 children, and he's sitting on the floor in ashes, with boils, scratching himself with a potsherd. And when Job's 3 friends heard about this calamity, so where these 3 friends come from, it's not really clear. It's not really clear whether they're part of his inner circle or traveling from afar. But here we start talking about how do other people comfort bereaved individuals. So, Vayishmeu shloshet re'ei Eov. So they found his 3 friends, maybe they were his only 3 friends, I don't know, heard about what had happened to him. They each come from their place. He's got his 3 friends are named Eliphaz HaTemani, Bildad HaShuchi, and Sofar HaNaamati. And they get together, right? So they get together, and it seems to me that they get together because they don't want to show up, because maybe they don't know what to say, right? And there's something powerful about looking at other people's losses and saying, I need to show up for that person, but I'm not really sure how. Can you walk in the door with me? And so I want to learn from that, that we don't always have to embrace somebody alone, right? Especially if we don't know what to say. And so we learn from this text, Lavo lanud lo ulenachamo. So they met together to go and console him. They saw him from afar and they didn't recognize him. And from a distance, I want to believe, Vayis'u kolam vayivku, vayikru'u ish me'ilo, vayizraku afar roshehem hashamayma. They don't recognize him, and so they break into this loud weeping, hopefully still at a distance from Job, right? They're not so far away because they can see him, but they're keeping their emotions at the door, or outside the door, and each one tears his own robe, and throws dust above his head, right? So they're, on the one hand, at a distance, and on the other hand, they see the destitution, they see the intense grief that their friend is holding. Maybe they see that he's got boils, and maybe he's totally unrecognizable at this point. And maybe it's just that he's unrecognizable because he is lost. And they do their expressions of grief outside. Then, Vayeshvu ito la'aretz shiv'at yamim v'shiv'a leilot, ve'en dover elav davar, ki ra'u ki gadal ha'ke'ev me'od. They sit with him on the ground, with him, for 7 days and 7 nights, and not a one says anything, for they saw how great was his suffering. And after 7 days and 7 nights of sitting with his friends, finally Job is the first to speak. Now, I started by saying, let us track the ways in which Job's expressions of grief and his friends' expressions of comfort are similar to the ones that we continue to use. And this is one of them. When we enter a Shiva house, it's really hard. And on Tish'a B'Av, especially so, we're not supposed to speak first. We're not supposed to offer platitudes. We're not even supposed to say hello. When we walk into a Shiva house, part of the reason that we as mourners leave the door unlocked is because we don't want to be in a position to answer the door and to say hello to people and create small talk. Now, again, I think that Job is the paradigm of the extreme here. Job has lost all of his children. There were 10 of them. Job is afflicted with boils. Job is sitting in silence with his friends for 7 days and 7 nights. But I would still say that one of the lessons we certainly learn from this is we speak only when spoken to in the context of comforting a mourner. And it's Job who speaks first. Now, we're only in chapter 3. We've only just arrived at chapter 3. There are 42 chapters. And basically, the next 37 chapters or so are Job having a conversation with his friends in long speeches. And Robert Alter, whose translation I'm primarily using, which is why I have been quoting him, says his observation is that Job is given this beautiful poetry. There are these long speeches that alternate between the friends and Job is giving these beautiful speeches, and the friends are basically just speaking in platitudes. They sometimes seem to quote Tehillim. They're not really sure what to say, and over the course of the book, they progress to saying all the wrong things. They go from sitting in silence and doing what's seemingly, keeping emotions outside, not speaking until spoken to, all of that. They seem to be comforting for the first 7 days, and then it kind of starts to devolve. So Job has this beautiful speech. We're not going to read the whole thing, I promise. But this is the first thing that he says. So he opens his mouth, and I'll just bring us to the translation of this. Job spoke up and said, and the word for spoke up, I'll show you this, is vaya'an. Vaya'an means Job answered. So it's not clear to me, right? We have just talked about the fact that Job's friends didn't say anything to him. So the fact that Job's friends haven't said anything to him, and yet he's answering, right? He's answering that, presumably that action. But it's not really clear that he's speaking to them quite yet. This is the first thing that Job says after this whole... Actually, the last thing that Job had said was to tell his wife to, shoo fly. So Job curses the day he was born. Perish the day on which I was born, and the night it was announced, a male has been conceived. Right? It's not even enough to curse the day that I was born. I curse the day that I was conceived. Right? May that day be in darkness. May God above have no concern for it. May light not shine upon it. May darkness and deep gloom reclaim it. Moving on. May obscurity carry off that night. May it not be counted among the days of the year. May it not appear in any of its months. May that night be desolate. May no sound of joy be heard in it. This is dark, dark stuff. And let me just say, for those of us who have been in those moments, it resonates deeply. Maybe I'll just speak for myself. And because for me, I have my experience. The fact is, he's talking about himself as an infant. Why was I not like a buried stillbirth, like babies who never saw light? The Bible makes reference to babies dying very rarely. And it's this weird kind of taboo culture. You see it throughout the Bible. I have seen it throughout the Bible. I have been paying attention to it for the last 10 months. The Bible alludes to the cultural knowledge that babies die, that stillbirths happen, that all of that is possible, but it doesn't happen, except in one case, 2 cases, to any of the characters in the Bible. And my assumption is that that's because the Bible wants you to think that God is responsible in full for issues of fertility and who gets to live and who gets to give birth and who whatever. And I still think it's interesting that the characters are culturally aware that this happens enough that Job isn't the first one to make reference to it in the abstract. But still, Job is talking about his own. Job is really in his own head right now, right? He's at his darkest moment, and he's cursing the day he was born, and my groaning serves as my bread, my roaring pours forth as water, for what I feared has overtaken me, what I dreaded has come upon me. That's verse 25. My worst nightmare has come true. That's what he's saying. And this is the conclusion of, this is the whole speech. And this is the conclusion of that speech. I had no repose, no quiet, no rest, and trouble came. Vayavo roges is the language he uses there. So it's at this point that his friend, right? We don't know if this is over the course of one day, if this is over the course of many days. We're not given any sense of timeline here, except for those 7 days that they sit together. But we are told, right? It's just Vaya'an Iyov. Job answers, and then at the very next line, his friend answers. So his friend answers in a whole chapter-long speech as well. Eliphaz HaTeimani is the first, and he doesn't know what to say. And he says, Hanisa davar elecha til'eh. If one ventures a word with you, will it be too much? But who can hold back words? See, you have encouraged many. You have strengthened failing hands. His friend starts by building him up and saying, you've been an example to us. Again, we don't go sour on Job's friends until a couple of chapters later. So, Job, chapter 4, chapter 5 are both Eliphaz's speech. And chapter 6, Job is still, he's listened to his friend, and he's still in his dark place. Job says in reply, if my anguish were weighed, my full calamity laid on the scales, it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. That is why I spoke recklessly. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit absorbs their poison. God's terrors are arrayed against me. And I want to bring you this text, this answer from Job, because it is the first time that Job points a finger at God. Right? In the first speech that Job makes, Job is saying, woe is me. But I don't even think that Job, in the entire speech, God is not mentioned, not once. And yet, so Eliphaz comes in, and Eliphaz starts bringing God into it, right? Minishmat Eloah Yovedu. And the message that Eliphaz has, and if you're interested in that, I'm happy to have you, or I would encourage you to read chapter 4. It seems to me that the question that Eliphaz is answering is, you have said all these platitudes that I am about to say to other people about how God is good, how we don't curse God, how God, we're from dust we are, into dust you will return. And in chapter 4, Eliphaz challenges Job and says, would those platitudes that you've said to other people, do those bring you comfort now? Right? Job, as far as we know, right, or read, has had a pretty comfortable life, right? And maybe Job has been, as he says, an example to others, strengthening others' hands. And yet, Job, are you ready to sort of put your money where your mouth is? Maybe that's not the right expression, but to say, are as you are now the object of these lessons, Are you ready to embrace them? And so Job obviously says, no, of course that's not working for me. Lesson learned. He doesn't say lesson learned, but I'm going to say, right, as we're, I started by saying lessons learned from Job. As Job is questioned and encounters this moment, right, where his friend says to him, I'm about to offer you all the platitudes that you've offered me or offered everybody else. We have to be really careful with what we say as the comforter. And I remember a conversation with somebody some time ago when that person said, well, I don't really like saying the traditional response to mourners, right? We have traditional words that we say to mourners. May the one who is everywhere comfort you among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. And I would say that question really comes to bear in this chapter. What if I'm not comfortable saying the words that are comforting or that are traditional, and instead say something else? Well, when somebody says, I don't want to say the traditional words, I'm going to say something else, I will tell you 9 times out of 10 what they say instead is the wrong thing, right? God wanted him back in heaven. First of all, it's not really a Jewish idea anyway, but maybe this was for the best, right? I see you shaking your head. This is the wrong thing to say, right? Maybe his quality of life wouldn't have been good if he had lived longer, right? I'm just listing things that people said to me in the past 10 months. I'm saying, look, and 9 times out of 10, when people think better, they find the words to say better things. And I will say that my lesson learned through all of this from my own experience is to say that what we should say is never asserting our own theology, right? God chose you for this. Don't say that. God chose him for this. God doesn't give you anything that you can't handle. That's one that I hear a lot, actually. I see that you're all making faces. Some of you are making faces. That's okay. That's good, actually. If you're going to say something, right, let's learn from the first chapters of Job and say, maybe not saying anything first is the right choice. But maybe if you're going to say something, or if you're in a position to say something, that what you're going to say is in the form of a question, right, and not in the form of a statement. Maybe that question is, how are you today? Right? It's a limited question, right? This is a strategy we all learn in pastoral counseling. How are you today? Right? I don't need you to tell me how you are in the grand scheme of things. How are you in this moment right now? How are you feeling? Or tell me a little bit about your son. Tell me about your mother. Who were they to you? This is a question I ask a lot, particularly when it comes to being at a funeral. If I see somebody who is not a member of the family, but seems to be deeply emotionally affected by that death, I often go up to that person and I say, who was this person to you? Right? And that gives them the opportunity to say, that person wasn't my mother, but I grew up in her house and, I would eat dinner with her children every night. Or this was somebody I worked with and they were the person who got me where I am today, or whatever it was. I think this is a very powerful question. Who was this person to you? Okay. Oof, time is flying. So, and I'm not planning to touch on every chapter of Job, just so you know. I will just maybe fast forward and say, Job, throughout the book, his thinking evolves. And so do his friends, right? His friends go from saying some of the right things and not necessarily all of the right things to saying none of the right things. And one of my favorite retorts is in Job 16, about halfway through the book, where he finally gets fed up with his friends. And he says, Shamati cha'ela rabot minachame amal kulchem. You are mischievous comforters. I don't love that translation, but okay. Have windy words no limit. What afflicts you that you speak on? I would also talk like you if you were in my place. I would barrage you with words. I would wag my head over you. I would encourage you with words. My moving lips would bring relief. If I speak, my pain will not be relieved. And if I do not, what have I lost? It's not clear to me, as it is to this translator, that verse 7 is talking about God. So I want you to see that the translator, this is I think the JPS, has capitalized the H and the Y of he and you. But I'm not sure why that translation believes that this is now talking to God. Now, maybe God has truly worn me out. You have destroyed my whole community. You have shriveled me. My gauntness serves as a witness and testifies against me. Have windy words no limit. I just, like, I want to say that to people rambling on. I just think that this is a great retort. But also to say, your words are empty. What you're saying to me means nothing. So it is only, right, chapters 1 and 2 are this sort of weird, God in the court of the B'nai Elohim and the Satan presumably goes down, and the 4 Malachim. What we didn't go over in chapter 1 and 2 is that there are 4 Malachim, which may be angels, messengers, whatever, who say that they've escaped from the court of God, and they're the only one who can tell Job what's about to happen. And it isn't until chapter 38 that suddenly Job is in conversation with God, right? So enough with the friends already, and the friends basically disappear. We're going to talk about them in a minute. In chapter 38, the Lord replies to Job out of a storm, out of a tempest, because Job has gotten to the point where he decides he needs to have words with God. And I mean, over the course of this book, Job decides that he needs to have words with God in general. But in general, God does not just show up to talk to people. And this is one of the stated arguments for the idea that I started with, which is that maybe Job is the alternate prophet not chosen by God at the time of Abraham, which is a theory that I think is interesting, because, one might say at that time was the time that God was talking to individuals in this way, aside from Moshe, and later in the parshiot that we're currently in, we hear, right, God doesn't talk to other people after God talks to Moshe in the same way. So if this is, God having a dialogue with Job, maybe Job lives around the time of Abraham. So God speaks, and the first thing God says to Job, who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Speak if you have understanding. Haged et im yadata vina. And God then, in chapter 38, spends an entire chapter, 41 verses. No, goes on to chapter 39. So 70 verses, where God is saying, I've been here from the beginning. I know everything. So I said at the beginning that I was going to take back what I said about this book being a counter argument to the theology of the rest of the Bible, because in chapter 38, where God comes roaring back in, it seems to me that this book is trying to reset the theology, where the theology of the first 37 chapters of the book is bad things maybe do happen to good people. Whereas the theology of the Bible leading up to that is God does good things for good people and bad things for bad people. And when bad things happen, you're at fault for some reason. In chapter 38, this is where God says, and this I believe is the root of the theology, which I have heard a lot, which is, among the other things you should never say to people, God has a plan that we just don't know. Right? Your suffering is part of God's master plan, even though you don't know what that's about. Now, I will not tell you that I don't believe that, right? Actually, speaking very personally, that's something that's a core value of my theology, as my theology has been tested this year. But it's not something that you say to somebody else. Right, whether you believe that or not, it does not. We are not in this world to impose our own beliefs on somebody else, particularly when they're suffering. And so, but if you're interested in a poem about God's might and God's impact on the world from time immemorial, this is at Job chapter 38 and 39. Are extremely powerful. And there are some references here to the shofar and God's, the noise God makes in the world. But it's, so God comes in, storming in, pun intended, and says, here's where I've been from time immemorial, and you are just a little piece of the puzzle, but don't think that you're more important than that. And in chapter 40, right, we get this word again, vaya'an. Vaya'an, almost every paragraph in the book of Job starts with vaya'an, as if it's a dialogue. So God was just the one speaking, and then in chapter 40, verse 1, vaya'an Adonai et Iyov. So I don't know what God was doing for chapters 38 and 39, because the first one says, God, vaya'an Adonai et Iyov min ha'se'ara. God answers Job from the tempest, and says, here, we just hear, God answers Iyov. So it's not clear, I think, whether Job has said anything since God's rant, right? God rants, and then God answers Job. So maybe God needed to say what God needed to say, and then give the grand soliloquy, and then focus on okay, God, you're a little bit off the rails here. You need to focus on the conversation you're supposed to be having with Job right now. And this then becomes a dialogue between God and Job, right? And maybe that's also Job is ready to speak, although after the language that God, roars in chapters 30 and 39, I wouldn't want to speak either. But God replies to Job and says, Harov im Shaddai Yisor. Shall one be disciplined to complain against Shaddai? He, not capital, that's Job, who arraigns God must respond. That's only capitalized at the beginning of a sentence. And so Job responds to God, see, I am of small worth. Hin kaloti ma'ashiveka. Yadi samti lemofi. I clap my hand to my mouth. Right? Literally, this is the image, right? I love where imagery. You see Job, you can imagine Job going like this. Right? I didn't realize that God was listening. Right? If I thought that God was listening, maybe I wouldn't have said what I said. So, Job is acknowledging the foot in his mouth, right? Because God has just come to talk to him. I have spoken once and will not reply. Job says, I now know that you're here. I'm done. And then the Lord replies to Job from the tempest again. I don't know, maybe we needed the special effects. And he says, gird your loins like a man. I will ask and you will inform me, right? When I speak to you, you respond. Please, right? Not please. Just do it. And God goes on yet another very long rant about God's power in the world. And one of my favorite lines from that, Timshoch livyatan bechaka uvechevel tashkia leshono. Can you draw out a Leviathan by a fishhook? Can you press down a Leviathan, right? A Leviathan is like a great big whale, right? Could you go fishing for a whale with a fishhook? Right? I can't, right? God's point is I can, you can't. So, but when I speak, you respond. So Job responds to God and says, Yadati ki chotuchal. I know that you're capable of anything and nothing is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures your counsel without knowledge? Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I did not know. Shemana v'anochi adaber. Hear now, and I will speak, this says Job. I will ask you, and you will inform me. I had heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. Therefore I recant, and I relent, being but dust and ashes. God, whoops, my bad. Forgive me. I'm going back to my cage, right? I got too big for my britches, whatever you want to say. So, cruising toward the end of Job, what happens? Right? So, on the one hand, Job says, whoops, too big for my britches, whatever, and backs off. But on the other hand, I would say that Job's progression, right? We know, whether it's from our own experience or from watching friends go through a process of grief, and that's not only when bereaved of relatives or friends, but also when we go through traumatic events in our own lives and traumatic separations and whatever that is, that our thinking evolves, right? That we are, after a traumatic event, inclined to be changed profoundly by that event, but then also to be recentered, not so far from where we started, and to figure out where the positives, right, where the meanings that were made from that experience were, and so in a kind of distressing way, the Job story ends with this restoration, and right, so 42 is the last chapter, and it's this weirdly orchestrated restoration, where in chapter 42, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord turns to Eliphaz, right, that first friend who spoke first about God and the platitudes, and says, I am incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Right, so his friends over the course of the book sort of get on the bandwagon a little bit about God being not so great, and take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. This, by the way, is another reason why the scholars don't place this moment in later temple times, right? Because why would Job be sacrificing? Because Job is not a priest. And let Job, my servant, pray for you, right? God still thinks that Job is capable of prayer. To him, to Job, I will show favor and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Eliphaz the Temani, Bildad the Shuhi, and Zophar the Naamati went and did as the Lord had told him. The Lord showed favor to Job. And here we go, chapter 42, verse 10. Vadonai shav et shivut Iyov behit palado ba'ad re'ehu. Vayosef Adonai et kol asher le'Iyov lemishneh. The Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed on behalf of his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice what he had before. For me, this punchline is really problematic, right? Because sometimes when things get taken away from you, you can't just replace them. Right? Job's 10 children were old enough to be having a party by themselves at the time that they died, where Job wasn't, right? So Job had 10 children who had like grown to adulthood, right? And the idea, the notion that Job gets 10 children and all the stuff back is not a restoration, right? I mean, it's maybe he gets to move on. But I will say that classifying that as a restoration certainly doesn't feel like it sits well with me. And I will say the following, because it's Tish'a B'Av, there's a sense that in the time of the Mashiach, whatever that looks like, that we wouldn't be observing Tish'a B'Av. But there's a conversation about, just because the Mashiach comes, or just because we rebuild the third temple, or whatever that is, that we're not entitled not to be mourning. It doesn't wipe away the mourning that we would have had from the loss that we had of that first temple, the second temple, right? That the, just because you get to be in a better place doesn't mean that bad things didn't happen to you, and doesn't mean that you forgot about them. In fact, there are those who would say that going through bad things makes you appreciate what you have more. Again, that's another platitude that I think people should never say. But so the restoration of Job, which is brief, right, in just the last few verses, is all his brothers and sisters, and right, so like this is, by the way, the first time we know that Job has brothers and sisters. So like, where were they? And all of his former friends. What is the word on that? V'chol yodei lefanim, the people who knew him before, came to him and had a meal with him at his house. First of all, that's a lot of people. And second of all, I don't know. Okay, we're going to pass that by for a second. And they came to comfort him for all the misfortune the Lord had brought upon him. So again, we don't know, except for that 7 days, what the timeline on all of this was, right? We don't know whether it's happening over, a period of a week or 2 weeks or 3 years or 17 years or whatever. And each one gives him a gift, a ksita, and a gold ring. Thus the Lord blessed the latter years of Job's life. Adonai beirach et acharit Iyov meireshito, more than the former. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 she-asses, and he also had, again, 7 sons and 3 daughters. Those were the 7 sons that we knew about. The verses that I omitted here from 14 to 16 are telling us the names of his daughters. We don't learn about his sons, and that's a whole nother conversation, I'm sure. And the very last line of Job, after all of this, is Job dies old and content. And I think what I want to learn from that, because I see that it's already 10:32, and as I did last night, because on Tish'a B'Av, our responsibility is both not to sort of create small talk and also not to wish each other well, that upon concluding, I'm going to close the meeting and I'm going to ask, we can reflect together at some other time, and feel free to send me emails or questions or whatever. But I want to say that the very last moment of this is that Job dies old and contented. And while I expressed some consternation at the idea that Job is restored in this second life he gets, I also want to say that I find this very short verse hopeful. That despite everything that happens to us, that we are, not that we're able to move on, but that we are in some way able to find contentment, that we're in some way able to find whatever it is that we need out of life that gets us to be old, and gets us to live out our days in a positive way, no matter what else we have from that life dishes out to us. So I want to thank you for joining me, although I'm not supposed to do that, and also to say that I hope through this hour what you have seen is that I am a pretty open book, with my own experience. That if there are things that you want to talk about, that you're welcome to come to me, either about my experience or about your experience. And that's where I want to stop. So I will sign off.